Good morning. I'm David Wessel. I'm director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy here at Brookings. I'm pleased to see so many of you here on such a gloomy day in Washington and to welcome people who are watching online. So everybody in the room should be careful what you say and do because someone out there will see you. The topic of today's event is understanding Fedspeak. When I came to Washington as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in 1987, the Fed didn't even announce when it had moved interest rates. They signaled them by the way they intervened in the money markets, and we at the Wall Street Journal had a good thing going because we were able to confirm the Fed's moves and made our reputation doing that. Then the Fed basically put us out of business around 1994, shattering tradition when they announced their rate increase. And since then, we've had lots of innovations, press conferences, projections of interest rates by Fed policymakers that you hear a lot about today. There is no question that there is more Fed communication and more transparency. The question we're going to ask today is how much of that is useful. We're really pleased to partner with John Faust of the Center for Financial Economics at Johns Hopkins University to ask what is the purpose of Fed communications really? What does the Fed do well? What might it do better? And what advice do people who are trying to communicate from the Fed have to the people who are listening? As Alan Blinder said just a few minutes ago, communication takes a speaker and a listener, and I think there's ample room to criticize the listeners as well as the Fed. Some of you may know, in anticipation of this event, we at the Hutchins Center sent a survey around to academic and market Fed watchers, and we tallied responses from 58 of them with my help of Peter Olson, our research analyst. The survey's online, as are the presentations that will be made today. A few highlights. The Fed got few A's when we asked people to grade communications, a lot of B's. Interestingly, the median grade from academics was a B, higher than the median grade from private sector Fed watchers, which was a C+. Only a third of the people in our survey said that they had a very clear or mostly clear grasp of the Fed's reaction function, which suggests to me there's room for improvement. There was a great deal of disagreement over the value of the survey of summary of economic projections, the famous DOTS, where the members of the Federal Open Market Committee project interest rates each to their own liking. 38% of the people found them useless, and 33% found them useful or extremely useful. And for reasons I don't fully understand, but maybe I'll understand at the end of the day, 73% of academics think that Fed communications is a big help to the markets, but only 44% of the people in the markets think that, which tells you either something about academics or the markets or both. Now, what we tried to do as we put this program together is recruit people from a variety of perspectives. We have some current and former Fed officials. We have people from the press. We have a blogger, Tim Dye. We have a number of private sector Fed watchers. Narayana Kocherlakota tweeted this morning that we made a mistake in not including one of the presidents of the Reserve Bank. And frankly, with the benefit of hindsight, I think he's right. I didn't quite anticipate that our survey would come down so hard on the presidents or that we'd be talking so much about the cacophony today. So I want to apologize for not including one of the Reserve Bank presidents. We've had a number of them on our stage before. I have a feeling this will not be the last time we talk about Fed communications and transparency, and I resolve to make it better next time. So we're going to start with a presentation by John Faust, who, as I said, is at Johns Hopkins. Then Alan Blinder, who's a visiting fellow here at Brookings from Princeton, will respond, and then I'll talk to them a bit, and we'll take some questions, and then we'll move to the next act. So, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. I'd like to add my welcome on behalf of the Center for Financial Economics. And I'd like to thank a lot of my former colleagues and former bosses for coming to talk about this very important topic. I think Ben Bernanke and Alan Blinder and Don Cohn and Jay Powell they've all got more experience in this than I have. And what I'd really like to say is that I'm going to try and set the table for a useful discussion for a bunch of people who have really been more invested in this topic than I have, and a number of them are actually more invested in this topic than I am, and that's the private sector folks. So let me just start with some general background about what are the reasons why the Fed tries to communicate. And there's lots of reasons, lots of good reasons to advocate transparency. Democratic legitimacy is one of them. A government body should explain itself to the people from whom its power is derived. Accountability. If folks are going to keep track of whether you're doing your job or not, you better be pretty clear about what you're trying to do. There's ancillary stuff like education and public outreach. All those things are potentially important. But the reason I'm going to talk about today, and the main one covered in this survey that David was talking about, is policy effectiveness. Policy seems to work best if people understand how it's going to work and make their plans accordingly. So if people understand how the Fed will react to bad news or good news in the economy, they can make their plans, make their investments, make their business decisions more astutely. Now, let me emphasize that this is a fairly new phenomenon. It was only around 1980 that folks really started to think like this. And at the Fed, it really wasn't until Ben came in as chair that the notion was really solidified that the central bank should try to be really clear about how it's trying to operate policy. So I think that's been an incredible advance, and I'm all for it. What I think we're all trying to talk about today, and certainly my emphasis, is on how to make transparency more effective. So one of the important facts, however, is that so Ben came into the Fed, and his plans to advance transparency were sort of rudely interrupted by the financial crisis fairly quickly. And so before we'd settled into kind of a new regime, we got the financial crisis. So I want to point out one thing about the new regime. There's various indicators of how much the Fed talks. Ben came in around 2006. And one of the notable facts here is that he seems to have stopped governors from giving speeches and caused bank presidents to give speeches. So they're talking twice as much, perhaps, the bank presidents. The governors, now this is partly illusory, the drop in the governors, because, as you know, the president and Congress have chosen to leave 2 seats empty, so we've got a couple less speakers than usual toward the end of that. I put this up both because it may shed some light on some of the results that David was talking about, but also just to make this point that the Fed was settling into a new dynamic when the crisis came. It didn't have an established transparency routine. And obviously the crisis made challenges that had never been there before. No one understood how the economy was working very well. The old rules were off. Because the Fed's policy interest rate was near zero, it couldn't use its standard policy tools and move to new ones. So let me say, for the critical phase of the crisis, where Ben was leading the Fed in a sort of first responder role, I'm not gonna talk about that a lot because that's a very unique situation. I personally think the Fed deserves high marks for that period, but I'm not going to talk about that period because it deserves a lot of discussion, but it's pretty special. I want to talk about what's more relevant today when we're out of this kind of first responder kind of situation. So I'm going to jump critical phase, high marks. So I'm going to jump to late 2010. And in late 2010, the Fed was about to initiate QE2, but also deep divisions started to appear on the FOMC. the economy had backed away from the precipice, perhaps, and the policymakers then could kind of take up some traditional views of being hawkish, worried about inflation, or being dovish, worried about the economy, falling back over the edge. And one of the things I want to emphasize is these aren't your great moderation disagreements that folks were having. In the great moderation, you might sit and quibble about 25 basis points up or down. This was really talking about whether expanding the balance sheet by trillions perhaps put the very existence of the Fed at risk, whether it could be unwound or whether we were doomed to high inflation, whether failing to do that might push us back near the edge where we face a Great Depression again. We're talking about really serious existential questions. And as it turns out, at the same time, this led to lots of transparency challenges. The Fed had not adjusted fully to this new regime of transparency, and yet faced how do you deal with deep divisions in the face of or in a world of transparency? Because whenever the Fed had deep divisions before, it was back in the old days where nobody said anything. So what happened? Well, people started staking out positions before the FOMC. In October of 2010, the FOMC had to hold a special conference call about communications issues. That started with Ben warning the group that this external communication, staking out positions, could ruin their ability to actually reach a decent decision inside the FOMC room. In doing that, he was essentially quoting James Madison, who said that the U.S. Constitution would have never been adopted if the delegates could have been speaking in public the whole time during the discussion. President Fisher in the December FOMC meeting warned about the cacophony and the dangers that might play for the Fed. Now, interestingly, speaking of transparency, 2010 is the end of the available transcripts. There's a 5-year window protecting the transcripts, so we don't know the end of this story. But I'm going to talk about the dynamic that ensued thereafter. Rapidly after these divisions appeared and began to cause challenges for the FOMC, we got reforms in how the minutes were written. We got the press conference being adopted. We got reforms to the SEP. We got adoption of a strategy statement. This was a long sequence of transparency reforms that have continued to this day as we talk about changing the SEP. These were not just how can we make transparency better. These were how can we balance the needs of maintaining internal deliberation against the needs of the legitimate needs of explaining policy. So that dynamic has continued to this day. And we basically come to this. Transparency in a contentious, deliberative negotiating situation, it fundamentally changes the policymaking process. So the question is, how do you have folks out speaking and arguing in public and still have a civilized discussion and reach a good policy inside? Now, I think the FOMC actually did a reasonable job of that, did a good job. It's a difficult problem. I don't know what you'd call a best job. They maintained, in my view, the ability to conduct reasonable deliberation. But that required lots of restrictions on transparency that led to some confusion. Now, at this point, it's probably a good place for me to confess that from the beginning of 2012, for the next 3 years after that, I was a special advisor to Ben and to Janet thereafter. So I witnessed some of this stuff. So I witnessed a bunch of this stuff from the inside. I was deeply involved in these issues about not only how to pick a good policy, but how to communicate it effectively. So let me just cut right to here. The FOMC strategy statement, which was adopted, the first meeting I appeared for, had nothing to do with it, has this nice line. The committee seeks to explain its monetary policy decisions to the public as clearly as possible. So that's not true, and it shouldn't be true. That shouldn't be true either. That's the point. Maybe if I have any major point here, it's that we need to be more realistic about what the goals are and what the needs are of deliberation. So let's talk about this famous dot plot. this is the first one that came out, January 2012. I'm going to claim it's ridiculous to assert that this is as clear as possible. Now, there's a different standard that Ben wrote about in his blog yesterday. Is it useful? Well, okay, it's useful. Is it as clear as possible? Well, no. So, for example, we don't know the output and inflation associated with any of these paths. Are the high paths by people who think inflation is really rising quickly, so we're behind the curve? Or are the highest inflation paths associated with folks who have very low interest rates, that is, people who think the economy needs a lot of stimulus? There's also, Ben pointed out that this is a sort of straw vote, which is true. It's a straw vote among 19 people, but only 12 of them vote. And the 7 non-voting presidents are selected in a way to make them not representative. The presidents are supposed to be more hawkish. So we've got 19 folks tilted toward the hawkish, pooled together. 12 of them are going to vote, and we don't know what the economy is doing in the background. I'm just saying it's not the clearest possible way to report this. So why would that be? Why didn't we just report the voters and the non-voters, or Ben's forecast? Well, we discussed that. And folks like, and Ben said, I think he can comment on this later if he cares to, that he would have been reticent to produce a forecast at all under that scenario, because everybody would have looked at his, overemphasized it. They wouldn't have looked at all the others. And then when he went to the others and said, so what's your opinion, and tried to build a consensus, it just wouldn't work anymore. In other words, you destroy internal deliberation and dynamics. So we get stuff like this, and it's not as clear as possible, and it's for a good reason, a reason we can all debate, but there's a reason there. Now, one critical issue is that unanimous consensus policy need not look like the typical dots. So everybody could agree on policy, and that policy could not resemble the typical dot, the median dot, the middle of the dots at all. And that's a really important point, because pictures like that kind of invite you to put a line through the middle and say that's where policy's going. But it turns out if the disagreement about policy is fundamentally about how the economy is working, and that difference is going to continue. So one group thinks inflation is just around the corner, and they think that for years. One group thinks it isn't, and they think that for years. So how will that be reflected in the dots? You'll see high dots and low dots. How will it be reflected in policy? Well, if one side turns out to be right, you'll see low interest rates as far as the eye can see. You'll never see those upper dots. So are those ignored? Is the chair running roughshod over the committee? Well, the answer is no. They're completely present, but in a conditional sense. If we ever see that inflation, we'll raise rates. So these are all conditioned on an assumption about the economy, and a bunch of those will never be realized. But you can't see from this picture that what was motivating those high dots. Now, if you want an example of this, there's a famous example from the Greenspan era, where Greenspan in the late 90s thought that there was a productivity boom and no inflation would be coming. The entire FOMC thought otherwise. And he ran policy consistent with no inflation coming, kept inflation low. But he didn't run roughshod over the committee. He said, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe we'll see inflation next time. If we do, we'll raise rates. And he was right for 5 years. And his dots would have been the lowest on the picture. And those would have been the ones that described policy. Now, the point is that it's really hard to get from the component views to the how they fit together in policy. So I've spent a lot of time on the SEP, but I want to more generalize this to both speeches and to the minutes of the FOMC. There's 2 categories of information. There's one category is that you explain the likely evolution of consensus policy. Obviously, that's important. That's what you need for policy effectiveness. The second category, you elaborate the FOMC's disagreements with no guidance about how that will be resolved. So you just talk about differences. Now, it turns out that the first is just fraught with all sorts of problems with screwing up internal deliberation. So you minimize that. You have the FOMC statement and the chair's press conference. That's where those happen. All the speeches, the SEP, the minutes, all just elaborate the differences in opinions. It turns out that those differences of opinions don't get you to the final policy very well, and they have greater potential to mislead than they do to actually inform. Now, whenever you criticize communication, people want to corner that as you're against communication. So when you argue for more effective communication, people say, why are you against communication? So all these things are great. The SEP is full of facts. The speech is full of facts. But the question is, can those add up into something useful? And is it effective communication? And I think that's where the Fed needs to, that's what I'd like to see out of the Fed. And so let me wrap up with this. Focus on effective transparency, how you communicate where the consensus will take policy. So in communication on behalf of the consensus, I think the Fed should be more explicit about the way in which the dispersed views are reflected in policy. Some folks are going along for this reason, other folks are going along for that reason. Otherwise, we're just baffled by when these folks give these different views about how we end up having unanimous policy when everybody's all over the map. So explain it a little better. De-emphasize or place in context all this disparate views in isolation. We don't need to hear so much about that, but I'm all for information, so if we do hear about it, it'd be nice if it was de-emphasized or placed in better context. Now sometimes people talk specifically about forward guidance, and this is my rule of thumb here, and it'll be the last thing I say. So if there's something true that can be conveyed about the likely course of policy, convey it. Otherwise, don't. And if that happens to be time-dependent, then it can be time-dependent. There's nothing inherently wrong with time-dependent guidance or any other form of guidance. If there's something true about the likely course of policy, convey it. Otherwise, try not to. And that rule of thumb should guide things over any specifics. So with that, I'd like to say my main goal was to promote a conversation among these folks, like I say, much more invested in this topic than me. And so I'll get out of the way and let Alan start that process.
Don't look at that yet. That was the end. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, and I'm glad to be here. This is one of my favorite topics, as some of you may know. I want to start with three very brief prefatory remarks about Federal Reserve transparency, the third of which will lead me smack into John's paper. The first two may seem like irrelevant digressions, but they're not, for reasons you'll see. So the first one is anyone who provides his discussant with a paper that has no page number should be subject to corporal punishment. You'll see why shortly. Second thing, I'd like to point out to everybody that the literary quote that begins John's title ends, he left this part out, when we first practiced to deceive. I don't think the Fed is trying to deceive, so I'd like to put that on the record. My third prefatory point is lead smack into John's the crux of his argument, but he doesn't quite state it this way, and I want to state it this way very clearly and harp on it. There is an absolutely fundamental distinction between what constitutes transparency under group accountability versus under individual accountability. And the FOMC has group accountability, not individual accountability. And I think that should be the lodestar that guides their communications. I'm going to be specific about that shortly. Many of the Fed's recent communications problems arise because members speak as if they have individual accountability, when in fact they don't. We don't see
we don't normally see. There are exceptions to every rule. Football players say at the end of a losing game, well, the team stunk, but I was good. Occasionally you do see that, actually, but it's pretty rare, and it's considered bad manners because the team has group accountability. It's supposed to win. The Federal Reserve is like that. So my first recommendation is that Janet Yellen should pound this distinction into members' heads until they are repeating it reflexively in their sleep. And the FOMC's official communications policy, which John quotes on page N of his paper, should be amended to emphasize that point. My second recommendation is that the chair should hog the megaphone more. After all, her words pretty much crowd out the others. If you have a day in which the chair has spoken and 3 other bank presidents have spoken, you know what's leading the Wall Street Journal the next morning. Okay, having said that, more explicitly to John's paper, methinks the gentleman doth protest a little bit too much in criticizing FOMC communications. So, for example, on page M, he writes of the, quote, ruinous dynamic in Fed communications. I'm not sure there's a ruinous dynamic. The truth is, and John pushes this point correctly very hard, and you just heard it, the truth is that conveying complicated attitudes accurately when the committee is deeply divided is a very difficult task. Add to that the fact that if push comes to shove, the chair of the committee does not literally have the authority to muzzle the other members. Why, the bank presidents aren't even government employees. Did you know that? Well, this is a very educated audience. You know that, but most people don't know that. You reach them on a .org, not on a .gov. And remember, most of the complaints about Fed communications, and the survey echoed this, come from private sector Fed watchers who make their living trying to outguess the Fed, and who, present company excluded, of course, tend to be a bunch of whiners about this. So, no one in this room, but there are lots of other people. So it's not surprising that when you come to page Q and get John's 3 recommendations at the end of the paper, they seem a little thin. And here I'm going to quote them and discuss each one. First, and these are quotes, depicting the policy as a reasonable and constructive compromise rather than treating it as the preferred choice of a unitary policymaker might raise trust and understanding. I agree with that 100%, and I'm going to come back to that. Second, quote, stop sharing so much information about the diverse views of FOMC members. I agree with that too, though not quite 100%. And as an example of that, I also agree with much of the criticism John levels at the dot plot, and I'm going to make a suggestion to improve that shortly. Third, quote, communication on behalf of the consensus might more clearly indicate the role of past errors. I'm going to disagree with that one. Here's a rhetorical question. What agency of government, or in the private sector for that matter, goes out of its way to publicize its mistakes? There are usually other people to do that for you, and the Fed has a plethora of such people. So I don't think Jay Powell, when he's sitting in his office, is thinking, I wish we got more criticism. Nobody ever says anything about our mistakes. So I don't think there's a shortage of that, and I think it's asking too much of the Fed to add to it. Now, let me come back to John's first recommendation. That's the most important. Group decisions are, by their very nature, quote, from John's paper, reasonable and constructive compromises, not, quote, choices of a unitary policymaker. That's what he said, and he's right. It's been a gross abdication of responsibility, I think, to allow this confusion to persist. Once the FOMC was transformed at the beginning of the Bernanke era from what in the language I've been using for many years, an autocratically collegial committee under Alan Greenspan to a genuinely collegial committee under Ben Bernanke and now under Janet Yellen. Let me take that point further into something I've long thought the Fed should do. And this comes right back to one of the points John was just making. I think it should admit to internal disagreements, explain concisely the main arguments on each side, and tell interested people, there are only a few of those, why the FOMC decided as it did. Now, there's Fed staff in the room who are going to say, that's impossible, blah, 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 blah. It's not impossible. As long as you don't expect the statement, which is short, to reveal every nuance of every argument. You have the minutes weeks later that can provide a lot more nuance, and you know there's no page limit, not that I know of, on the minutes. So to make this idea more concrete, I want to offer, now if I could see the slide, a rewrite of the policy paragraph, which was the third paragraph of the last FOMC statement. I picked this only because it was the last one, no other reason. So the Fed wrote, you can read it, against this backdrop, the committee decided to maintain the target range for the Fed funds rate at 0.25% to 0.5%. Now, the explanation. The committee judges that the case for an increase in the Fed funds rate has continued to strengthen, but decided, for the time being, to wait for some further evidence of continued progress toward its objective. Well, really? So how did the case strengthen between the previous meeting and this one? And why was that strengthening not yet strong enough to pull the trigger? And most importantly, what further evidence was the committee waiting for before it was going to move? So here's my suggested rewrite, which takes 72 more words. I counted them, or Microsoft counted them. The first sentence is exactly the same. The explanation. The committee carefully considered several arguments voiced by a minority of participants. Note that that was the losing side, for raising the target rate, blah, blah, immediately. These included the notions that the economy is already at or near full employment, that the situation creates a danger of rising inflation, and that keeping interest rates near zero is contributing to financial instability. The majority of the committee concluded, however, that the more prudent course of action was to wait because, that was missing in the previous, there is probably still some labor market slack. Inflation remains below the committee's 2% objective. Signs of rising core inflation are minimal, and there are few indications of serious financial instability. Now, if you're thinking transparency, you may have noticed that my suggested rewrite, just like the original, omits what is probably the most important reason for waiting, which was there was an election 6 days later. We don't want, as John said, we don't want that much transparency. And by the way, I'd like to see the Fed offer to trade these fuller explanations in the statements and much fuller explanations in the minutes for eliminating the verbatim transcripts, which no one reads anyway except historians, or at least releasing them with a much longer delay. This is a trade-off. Here's more useful information. We take away some useless information that actually stifles the debate. One last point. Peter's sign is on 0. This won't take long, Peter, don't worry. I want to make one last point about the monetary effectiveness argument for greater transparency, which is the one that John correctly emphasizes, but he doesn't mention this point. I'm sure he doesn't disagree with it, but I want to because I've always thought it's important, and that's this. The FOMC and the financial markets are in a perpetual kind of dance that is often adversarial, but can and should be made symbiotic. Why? The markets are constantly guessing what the Fed is going to do. And the Fed is always trying to guess what the markets would do in reaction to its policy changes. It's always seemed to me that if and as the markets get better at predicting the Fed would automatically get better at predicting market reactions, and that would help make monetary policy better. And I want to finish with that. Oh, yeah. John, you want to come up? Where do you want me here? Yeah.
Well, thanks to both of you. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to turn to the audience so we can get back on schedule. It seems to me, John, that what you're saying is that somehow the view of the consensus, the one that would be most useful to the markets, is being hidden behind a lot of other comments, right?
Well,
The stuff that's about the disagreements is getting too much attention, and the statement of the reaction function not enough.
So I guess being hidden, I wouldn't agree with, because that indicates some sort
Obscured.
of intent to
No,
deceive,
no,
which
no.
I
I
agree
mean,
with Alan.
obscured because...
Obscured
Right.
is certainly the right word, and so Alan and I are agreeing. Do more of that. Find some way to emphasize the other less. Yeah, that's the main.
And what do you think of Alan's suggestion that the statement be more forthcoming on what the disagreements were?
That was my first suggestion, so I guess I agree with that.
You like his wording? Well,
Oh, his particular wording? Yeah, something like that I think is possible.
So, Alan, some of this, it seems to me, is, as you pointed out, the nature of having a group. If you had a single central bank governor, we wouldn't have this problem. You've argued that we get better decisions when we work in a group. But you had that interesting football team analogy, but we have other groups that work on a different system. The Supreme Court, they don't have a problem with having 5-4 decisions, and they have precedents that people can rely on. The Bank of England seems to have a different tradition where you can even, the governor can be in dissent and the world doesn't come to an end, which it seems to here. What's the matter with that kind of approach?
There's nothing the matter with it, but it's a different way of organizing the committee decision-making. This goes back to what I said before. Those two examples you cited are cases of individual accountability. That's explicit in the Bank of England Act. Every governor has individual accountability. In the Supreme Court, it's tacit. That's why you got all these dissents and agreement. You know, even if you agree, you issue a statement. You're personally accountable for your opinion. We don't run the Fed that way. We could. I mean, you take the example of the Bank of England. We could run the Fed that way. We never have. I'm not convinced it's a better way. Maybe it is, but it's not. The point is, it's not the way.
I see.
And my main point is the way you communicate is fundamentally different if you have individual accountability versus group accountability.
And
Okay.
let me say that that isn't just a happenstance. That's the way the framers of the Fed and the FOMC back in the 30s intended it. There's a reason why there's 12 votes on the FOMC. That's an even number, as you may know.
High grades in math in college, is that why I get grief?
The idea, and if you read the hearings, the idea was that you get group folks together that when society is deeply divided, those divisions are represented on the FOMC, but then they try to reach a deliberative answer, and it's just a different model,
Right, okay.
and so you could make a case for the other model, and then we'd say, fine.
Right. So basically what seems to me you're arguing is that we would be good if we could find a way to have more signal from the Fed and less noise. And much of the conversation of noise seems to come from the dots, which you discussed at length, and from our survey and what other people have said from the, and you had that chart about the number of comments made by the presidents. So So I think one reason the presidents speak out is that they have learned that the Fed is not well understood in their communities, and they look at their job as talking more to Main Street than the Board of Governors does in general. So some of the volume may be a response to the Fed's unpopularity and the political challenges to it. That doesn't go to the content, that just goes to the number. So I want to ask you a question and Alan a question, then we'll go to the audience. What advice, John, would you give to a new Fed bank president about what's the appropriate role of his or her public communications?
Well, the communications policy that the FOMC adopted in 2011 in light of the cacophony problem says that the Reserve Bank presidents are supposed to explain consensus policy, and in doing so, they're basically supposed to mimic what the chair said in the press conference and the FOMC statement, and then they can give their own view. Now, as it turns out, what they do is they maybe mention the statement, and then they give their own view. I don't think that's helpful. I think they might spend more time reiterating and explaining why the consensus is doing what it's doing, and then could say, by the way, especially if the statement showed these different opinions, like Alan and I are both saying, well, I'm in this group actually. I don't fully subscribe to this, but I do to that. But emphasize the consensus more. We had a talk earlier on about this FOMC policy, and I guess we basically agreed that the president seemed to be following the letter of that policy, but not necessarily the spirit.
Right.
And I think they should, follow the spirit.
And Alan, do you think that the dots, the famous dots, would be more useful if we saw each individual policymaker's forecast for the economy as well as their forecast for interest rates?
Well, sure, but I think you're asking a lot. I think you're asking too much for people to lay that out and to, this comes back to the thing you quoted me as saying before, you have to have a receptor and an emitter, and I think you're looking for real problems between the emission and the reception if you do something like that. The other thing I was worried about when the dot plot, I'm going to say two things about dot plot very quickly, came out that turned out not to be a problem, is I thought that would start an unending a battle to put names to dots in the media. I seem to be wrong. Probably reporters tried, but if they did, they gave up. There's just not been a lot of that, with the exception of always trying to guess which is the chairman's.
I think you're not a close reader of the press and the market.
You think there is? Okay.
Yeah. Everybody gives a speech, and then you can do that dot, and by process of elimination.
Right. So that was one of the things that bothered me when the dot plot came out. As opposed to treating it, for example, the way the GDP forecast is. Here's the midpoint, here's a range, no names about who is where. The second thing that bothered me a lot, I forgot, actually looked up the first dot plot that you showed because I forgot how spread out the dots were. That only can give the impression that these guys and gals don't know what in the world they're talking about. And, first of all, I don't think that's actually true that they don't know what they're talking about. And secondly, even if it was, it's not something you want to advertise.
So what advice would you give to the listeners as opposed to the emitters of the signal?
You're addressing me?
Yeah.
Number one is put 98% of your attention on the chair, and 2% you can scatter around. As
2% get more sleep.
Well, yeah, yeah. That's the corollary to the chair should command the stage more. Secondly, this varies a lot by person. For some people, reduce this fetish about the Fed's reaction function. Some people sort of take it almost literally. It's a metaphor. There isn't a reaction function, but there is a systematic reaction to economic events, not all of which can be sandwiched into the Taylor rule, for example. And I think this come to be, literal, you hear this all the time. The Fed's got to tell us more about its reaction function. I think, by the way, that if the Fed did something more like that statement that I put, that phony, I guess we call that fake news now?
The market's probably moved on that, Alan.
I didn't get that from, what's the guy's name? Alec Brown? Is that, if the Fed said things more like that, I think it would be very revelatory about the metaphorical reaction function.
Metaphorical reaction.
So could I?
Yeah.
Could I add one thing?
If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll get one of the mics to you.
So just to clarify what, I'm sure Ellen agrees with this as well, these speeches have a lot of stuff in them. If you want to know what the consensus is likely to do with policy, listen to the chair. There's lots of good arguments about the economy and the thoughts of all that stuff may be valuable. It just doesn't help you understand where policy is going. So if you want to know what policy is going, listen to the chair. As for all the other content, there may be many miraculous thoughts involved.
There's a question back there. Jared, can you wait for the mic? And please tell us who you are, or I'll tell you who you are. So, it's not on.
Speak out loud, back.
I'll repeat the question. So,
I could barely switch. It's very small. Sorry. There we go. So I think somebody said that the Fed governor should give fewer speeches. And that strikes me as a bad idea, because I think that we add to the signal when we read those speeches. And let me very quickly just give an example. So Governor Brainerd recently started talking a lot in her speeches about an international dimension to current thinking about monetary policy involving capital flows and the extent to which they are the extent to which they're on more of a hair trigger, sort of, I'm paraphrasing. And I thought that I saw those considerations work their way into the FOMC statements in a way that made sense to me. So I felt that that was a good example, and I think there are others, of how the governor's speeches boost the signal. Did I hear a pretty explicit disagreement with that?
I don't think either one of us said the governor should speak less. I didn't hear that.
I think there was some about the presidents should speak less. And I think what John was saying is that there's a lot of content in the speeches, but when they appear to be predicting what the Fed is going to do at the next meeting, which seems to be what some people in the markets care about exclusively, they can be misleading.
I don't think there'd be any harm, and probably some good, done by having plenty of speeches by governors or presidents if they hewed to the standard that I was suggesting before and John was suggesting before. If there were statements in the statement and in the minutes of the nature of the disagreement on the committee and which arguments won and which arguments lost, I don't think it's harmful for it would be harmful for the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of X to say, you know, I put more weight on this argument than the full committee did.
Yeah, Ralph? Behind you, Ralph.
It's right there.
I haven't.
Ralph Bryant, Brookings.
Sorry. I haven't heard the word uncertainty. Didn't read it in your thoughtful paper, John, or Alan, you didn't mention it, but people like Don Cohen have said, shouldn't we be characterize the uncertainty about as a help to making policy? I'm very sympathetic to that. Would a fan chart like they use at the Bank of England be helpful? I don't have a sense about exactly what to do, but I think it's the uncertainty that maybe deserves more emphasis than it was getting in both of your.
Okay, in case, because I think the mic wasn't working, the question was, is there a way for the Fed to better convey the uncertainty in its outlook and its forecasts?
Well, so I think one advantage in that, if we think that this information gets too much attention, making the lines blurrier can't be a bad thing. So I guess I agree with that. But I think the fundamental problem understanding the dot plot is that the different parties have a different modal outlook. So some think inflation's right around the corner and others don't. There's uncertainty around those modal outlooks. And then there's however we put our weight on, which group is right. And I think mixing all those notions, it's difficult to do in a coherent way. So right now, the Survey of Economic Projections just has a discussion of historical error rates in forecasts, just to indicate that these are fuzzy. But just putting some sort of uncertainty bands around pictures that are premised on different modal outlooks is difficult to interpret.
Isn't part of the problem here that people in the markets want more certainty from the Fed than the Fed can possibly deliver, given that the future is unknown?
Yes. And that's why everybody will focus right on the middle of the fan chart. That's what they do in England.
Right.
So I also think
Let me say
that-
one more thing. Oh,
Yeah,
man,
go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to make one quick observation about fan charts. I generally like them better than lines for the reason that John said. But the truth is that these observations are, it's impossible to think about what probability distribution these are drawn from, because you're getting some kind of rump consensus of nowadays 17 opinions, and we know from what some of these people say, they are not from the same probability distribution. That much I know, but what probability distribution they're drawn from, I don't know. And so I don't really know how to read a fan chart. And I think one consequence of that is people just look at the middle